Awesome. And my name's Kim Lewandowski. For those of you I haven't met, I'm on the Google open source security team. So I work closely with Abhishek and Tom and helped get Salsa off the ground here from the Google side. So I will share the meeting notes, and we have a couple of logistical things just to get through in the beginning. And then there's a bunch of discussion topics on there as well. Cool. All right. And one thing about the recording, so I try the last recording is on there's a link to it down below. These are posted in the Open SSF channel, so I try to make sure I get them up there pretty quickly. So if you ever, and then we'll try to make sure I update our notes with the link to the latest recording. So feel free to check it out there. And so at the top we collect like just attendee list. So feel free to opt in and add your name. I'll pop a link to this doc into the GVC, into the chat too. And just so it's up here. Most of our docs we've been sharing with the Salsa discussion Google group. And so usually that's what will give you access. But I mean, it's fine to share things completely publicly as well. And I think it's probably encouraged. I've noticed on some other public docs we'll get like a bunch of spam comments and things. So I don't know if that's going to become an issue, but there is that Google group up there. Okay, cool. And then is there anyone new on the call? So it looks like if you all sort of went through a bunch of intros last time. Is there anyone new on the call that wants to introduce themselves quickly?
Sure. My name is Ian Childress. I'm an engineering manager at Polyverse. And what we do is we recompile and build Linux packages. And I'm interested in finding out how to secure our supply chain better.
And
hello.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, okay. My name is Mikey. I'm an engineer in Israel, a small little startup doing DevSecOps. And we're looking at Salsa as a guide to build our tools and to.
Very cool.
Yep. And this is Alex Kaputska. I'm a manager within PwC's cybersecurity practice. And I'm looking at Salsa to kind of help navigate some of my clients through securing their supply chain.
Nice. Very cool. Awesome. Anyone else? No? Okay, cool. So the next thing I have on the agenda is just a recap from last meeting. And Abhishek and Tom or whoever else was there, is there anything you wanted to discuss quickly from last meeting? I know there's discussion about the steering committee. There is a PR that I linked to that set up the steering committee for Salsa. Any other items from last time to discuss? Oh, cool.
The good news is the notes are below.
Yeah, thanks for the great note taking. Feel free to jump in, anyone, and help with note taking. And then the next thing I had was just meeting facilitators. So I'm happy to, help try to drive these meetings, and wondering if anyone else wants to volunteer. Feel free to throw your name in there, let us know, and then we can try to rotate who can, help drive this meeting. And then the last small item is we are planning a workshop just to help build out a roadmap for Salsa. I believe Peter from Projects by If is on the call and has invited most of the steering committee members. Peter, I'm not sure if you want that to be like a larger group, or if you have input on the size, or.
We are still designing the workshop, so we will design it to suit the size of the group who are coming along. So if the community wants to expand it out, then feel free to do that, and we'll work accordingly.
Okay, cool. And then the best way, should I just have them reach out to you directly if they're interested, or is that easiest?
That's probably easiest. I'll put a contact email address in the chat now and in the document so everyone can get to it.
Awesome. Cool, cool. All right. And now we can jump into discussion topics. Let's see. Who wants to go first? So who added some of these? Is this you, Tom? Is this a more general discussion?
Yeah, yes, I think so. So like, one of the things that that we've been discussing is that it's like there are some issues that have come up, and it's a little bit difficult to know how should those things be resolved, because I don't think that we necessarily have agreement on what are the goals of each of the Salsa levels, what are the goals of Salsa generally. So I as a first part to that, what is the goal for Salsa generally? So far we've been thinking that that Salsa should be focused primarily on integrity, and that it can provide a basis by which you can build other things sort of on top of it. Like it's one thing to do vulnerability scanning of code. It's another thing to know that code, that source code that you scanned in that Git repo is actually what was delivered and running in production. So I think my proposal might be Salsa itself is just integrity, and we can build other things on top of that, but those would be outside of the scope of Salsa.
I will note that at least the repo, when you look at it, doesn't say it's just supply chain integrity. It says increasing levels of software security and supply chain integrity. I mean, as long as it's clear, there's always a case for if it's too big, maybe we can't do it. If it's too small, nobody cares.
Right.
But at least I think on the current repo, it says it's including security as well as more generally, not just integrity.
Yes, and I there's been a lot of churn in the repo lately. That could be simply a factor of some of the wordsmithing that has happened. That could have been a mistake from the initial documentation. I don't know that we need to stick with just whatever the repo says now.
So I think the last item on the agenda probably relates to this good deal, because we haven't really fleshed out how you extract security properties or whatever from integrity guarantees. But I think that's absolutely an intent, definitely. I think, Tom, to our mind. But I don't know. It probably is ultimately what users or the community does want, right? You want to be able to get some value from the information you're recording, however secure.
Right, I agree with both of you that focusing here is a good idea. Making it too small and too big is not great either. I think as long as Salsa can give you integrity guarantees for one particular software chain, supply chain, the one that you're looking at right now, you don't necessarily need to include information about other supply chains you're using. You can maybe pull it up recursively, but I don't think it should be a strict requirement. And then you can go as big as you like. Some people want SBOMs, some people want to include wallet scans by default, and then I'm afraid Salsa becomes too big and unmanageable.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. The only thing that I think we should make clear is make it clear that we aren't, we're it's out of scope. Like the other folks' supply chain is out of scope, but it is still obviously a security concern, just out of scope for what Salsa's attempting to do.
I'm curious too if there are other frameworks that folks know of that might capture more of the security elements. Something that's come up in conversations that I've been having, like, does it cover things like scanning? Hi, David. Yeah. Like, is the artifact scanned, and should that be its also requirement? And I think that's sort of what we're trying to discuss now, like what's in scope versus what's out of scope. So I'm wondering if there's some other frameworks that we should keep in mind, like to complement. David, do you want to talk about?
Sure, why not? The elephant in the room, hopefully a small elephant. So I lead the CI Best Practices badge, CII Best Practices badge, which has a bunch of criteria focused on security in general. There are some integrity things, though not quite as focused. On the other hand, there's a whole lot of other things that are more general security, scanning, that sort of thing. Also, it's specifically for open source software. We've had occasional discussions about how to also handle proprietary software, but at least for now, and I suspect for a while, it's really focused on open source software. So it doesn't cover exactly the same things, and I certainly want to make sure that someone can do both Salsa and the best practices badge if both make sense. And I think at least in the case of open source software projects, that should make sense.
What about the new NIST guidelines for executive order critical software? So I mean, that's meant to be very practical, but I bet there's some benefit if we try to compare them with Salsa.
I've been following this thing in great detail. Kim's been following this to at least some extent, I think, as well. NIST has been asked to do a number of things, and U.S. government agencies more generally, for this executive order. Somebody asked, can someone link to the NIST guidelines? Well, actually, that's a little bit of a challenge right now. For the most part, they don't exist. There's EO guidelines that say that things will exist. That said, there are some things that exist right now. Perhaps the most pertinent in terms of specific must-do X's kind of thing, although must is probably the wrong term. NIST has released a how do you evaluate software, but it's really a laundry list of use static analyzers, use fuzzers, use this, use that. Is what could you do to analyze software? And I said the word must there, and I shouldn't have said that, because in fact it doesn't say you must do all these things. It's much more of a, here's some things you should think about, but it's not a requirement. There's another area. Now, the EO does talk a whole lot about software bill of materials, and there's an implication. Then they specifically asked, hey, NTA did identified a minimum viable. Are there things that need to be added? So there are things that are in progress. They have released some things. NTA has listed some guidelines. I'll note, but there's enough. Basically, there's a lot we don't know yet. Kim, you feel free to correct whatever I misstated.
Yeah, I mean, that's about as much as I'm aware of too. I think we'll be hearing more and more very soon. So it could definitely be something that we talk about every few weeks in this group, and how we can potentially be aligned with what's going on there.
In many ways, it may be the other direction. I actually submitted a whole bunch of papers to NIST about these topics, and you'll either be delighted or horrified to know that I specifically pointed to Salsa, as well as the best practices badge and scorecards and some other project.
So yeah, I wanted to point two things here which are not part of the supply chain integrity. One is the continuous security testing things like fuzzing guidelines, and the second is vulnerability management. So I would say those are part of supply chain security, but not of integrity. So I think they shouldn't be part of Salsa, but obviously curious to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I think there's two parts to some of the things when thinking about, I think, the supply chain scope. There's like the integrity of the supply chain itself, and then there's also the other component, which is how they get in to attack the supply chain. I think that second part is probably mostly out of scope, outside of saying, hey, you know, like yeah, if you don't, if you do not secure your build system, at the end of the day, they're going to find a way in and compromise that. The second thing that I also wanted to bring up as just another thing that I know it's another, they're calling it a standard, the OWASP SCVS, the Software Component Verification Standard. I know that's one thing that's out there. There's some interesting stuff in there. I think a lot of very good principles. There are some concerns, I think, with some contradictory things in there. Like as an example, you know, you should have a reproducible SBOM, but then they also say all SBOMs must have a timestamp. So which is it? But that's, I think there is, I think, at least a lot of good information in that thing as well.
So just Michael, just to revisit something that you said earlier, you were mentioning that, like, you know, that if people don't secure their builder, and if an attacker gets in that way, that like were you saying that should be out of scope for Salsa or in scope?
Well, I think if it is in scope, we just need to be clear with which pieces are in scope, because we can, like, that can obviously go as broad as we, you're right, like, or do we want to say, hey, make sure that, you know, a developer's workstation is also secured against a, you know, its own set of attacks, because you know, a developer's workstation could also be used as a way to eventually compromise the supply chain. Do we want to focus on just which pieces? I think we just need to be clear if it is in scope.
Okay, so like at the moment, at least, Salsa does have some requirements that go to how the builder should be secured and how the source control system should be secured. And generally, there aren't any requirements on how the developer's workstation, or I should say that there aren't any requirements on how the developer's workstation is secured. I think partly because we are depending upon the other requirements, like the like code review that is managed by a separate system, and like the source control system and the builder platforms requiring two-party auth for any configuration changes, and that should help it to hopefully not matter if the developer's workstation has been compromised, because that's probably going to happen.
Even if you limit yourself to integrity, I think you can make a decent case that supply chain integrity depends on, you know, some properties of the build process. that certainly doesn't make my head explode.
No, so the way I've been thinking about it, and maybe this is something that could, well, just focusing on the sort of outcomes or the security properties, like the builder should not be, or, you know, for source code, the user should not be able to unilaterally submit code. In that case, maybe you just bound it at the user identity. And similarly for builders, you say it should have some, I don't know, should have some very limited or zero set of people who can interact directly with it.
Yeah, I would say authorized people. One of the tricks, I think, and I've mentioned this before, a huge number of open source projects, there's one person. So, you know, how we handle that, I think, is going to be a little tricky. But It's not. It's totally doable. It's just have to think it through.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that there's two things that come to mind based on what Matthew just said, which was like one thing was like zero trust, right? Like some of these things sort of, hey, if you're assuming some of the network stuff is probably not secure in the first place and you're focusing on identity, then you can kind of say, hey, look, you know, on that end. And then the second thing, which is related to, I think, some of the secure builder and some of the other things that Salsa, I think, helps out with is like, Salsa is fundamentally incompatible with shadow IT, right? And so, like, I don't know how we want to sort of state, like, look, this is, you know, this, you need to solve your shadow IT problem in order to get the benefits from Salsa. Because if folks are just working around whatever you're doing to sort of generate, you know, Salsa, and I get that we're going to try and include that metadata signed in the, you know, in toto and whatnot, but if those sorts of things are, like, if folks are still finding a way to deploy random stuff to production, it's kind of, you know, it's a moot point.
I'm also curious about how, so I know one of the goals for Salsa was to make a lot of these things, properties, automatically verifiable. I'm curious how we'd make some of these properties, like, I don't know, only authorized people can administrate the CI/CD automatically verifiable. That's something to think about.
Yeah, I don't think that is. I've not been viewing it as, you know, a realistic option to, you know.
Well, so to disagree with Matthew somewhat, what we do, like, what we've been thinking about and the way that, like, we handle this with our internal builders is that there are some properties which are sort of self-evident, and then there are others where, like, you need to trust whomever the attester is, and you need to have an idea as to why, if they make some claim, you can trust it. And what we've sort of been thinking, and there might be other ways to do this, is that at higher Salsa levels, that there might be some sort of accreditation process by which some, like, third party, like, analyzes a builder's design, analyzes a source control system's design. Maybe there are red teams and other things, and then they come and they can, like, they could countersign the signing keys that builder uses to sign provenance, and, like, you could sort of bootstrap it that way and say, aha, this has been signed by an OpenSSF Salsa level 3 key, so therefore it, like, meets the Salsa level 3 requirements, or, like, it meets these sort of implicit requirements.
Yeah, I was not considering that to be automatically verifiable. Like, saying there's a certification process, I think, discounts a lot of that. It's great. Like, I agree that I think that's realistic, but it's not something you can, like, hook up to CI and say, provided this is trusted, hey, you're you know, automatically verified.
So I'm typing in a proposal here, which is basically, hey, if it's easy to make something verifiable, great. But I think in general, that's totally not reasonable for things that are important. This is actually one of the distinctors between the CI best practices and the scorecards project. The scorecards basically says, we're going to figure out what we can measure automatically. And what's great about that is scale. You know, you can scan everything. The problem, of course, is that what you can automatically examine is not necessarily what's important. So this is, you know, there's so many things that are just, even if you can automatically verify them, only in certain cases, not in the general case. So, you know, I think it would be unwise to make Salsa require that Salsa only check things that can be automatically checked.
Yeah. So right. So this is probably a difference in terms of what people mean by automatic. What I mean is that when an artifact and, like, attestations about that artifact are presented at some verification point, that verification point can look at the artifact and can look at those attestations and evaluate it against some policy, and then make a yes or no decision as if that artifact should be admitted. And that part of that process can like leverage prior accreditations that have happened, but that decision should be able to be made at that point, and that might require other like human analysis much earlier in the process.
Okay. Yeah. That makes all right. Yeah, I see. There's a fine. There's a hair that's being split, and it's not really. It's pretty important. So I think if I understand you correctly, I agree with you. But at some point, what I want to avoid is the I never need a human. Everything can be completely determined automatically, and I don't think that that's reasonable for Salsa. I think if, for that kind of task, I would want to move that to scorecard, which is very much focused on that. But if you focus it back to at some point, some human makes an assertion, and we can automatically verify that, retrieve that information. Sure.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Michael. Like the big difference here is like mutually trusting versus mutually distrusting parties. So like inside an enterprise versus just distributing open source and having someone know about your situation and consume it.
And this is something we spoke about, I think, in the last week, because we were talking about like, look, on certain areas, you can absolutely put a technical check and absolutely check the box and say, this meets this category of Salsa. But on the other stuff, it's really up to the individual, the company in that little area. And this is one of the things where we had talked about maybe coming up with a way to go in and verify that. Like if we're a package deployment company, so we can cover certain aspects, but when you go back to the software build side of it, it's really in our customers to basically do the right thing there. But could we provide a service that would go back in and say, we'll walk through and kind of do a security audit with you to make sure you're meeting all these Salsa things. So then you can say, okay, we've checked and a second party's kind of checked us and validated that we meet Salsa level 3 or 4 or whatever you decide.
I attempted to capture that in the notes. I may be wrong.
I think we hinted it last week, David, but I can help make sure we put that in there if you want.
Okay.
Does that resonate with others then?
Can I ask a question?
What's that?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
At what point is there a connection between the provenance of set by humans or by a previous check? For example, if a developer pushes code to his CSM, his gate, and you sign it in total, you send home, you send this signature out, the next step, the build step, should have some kind of connection to that provenance, the previous one, so we can show not only that I built my CI, my application in a specific way, but I built it in the specific flow that the previous step in the flow was two reviews reviewed in the pull request, and beforehand, wherever the policy defines, there has to be a connection between the points in the chain. My question is, where does it happen?
When you say connection, sorry, go ahead.
So I can talk about this some, or at least about how like we've been thinking about it, and that is that the Salsa provenance, which is created by the builder, should wind up indicating which source control systems the source was pulled from, including the git commit hash, right? And so in that provenance, you say this like binary artifact was like built from like all of these sources at these hashes. And then there's this other issue that I linked to in chat about creating an attestation that captures the source control system's security settings. I have a proposal which I have yet to provide, but the idea is that that the subject of that attestation would be like the git commit, and so then you would bundle up all, like you would have a source control. The builder, when it's building the thing, it would also get these source control attestations for each of the repos that it pulled from, and it would bundle the build provenance along with all of the source provenance, provide it to some sort of, and then provide it to the policy engine, and then the policy engine can look at the build provenance and then go down each of those listed source control systems and join it with the provided source attestation and ask questions like, does this source control system meet the Salsa level that we're targeting?
So one of, if I understand correctly, one of the materials for the build system is the previous provenance. It's somehow
that's like, I think that's yet to be agreed upon, but that's sort of what we were thinking. And that for source, we were hoping that that these attestations can be stored in the source control system. Like you could actually store these attestations within something like a Git note, so that every time the code review system does a merge, it can issue a new attestation that says, hey, this merge had two-party review and met these other properties.
Okay, thanks.
Tom, is the issue you linked to where this discussion is happening too, or is there create a new?
That is the best place. At the moment, it just talks about defining the predicate. But there's no other place where that is currently discussed.
David, were you going to chime in, or you're good? Were you going to say something, David?
No.
One quick question there, because I know that Salsa itself is talking about currently non-transitive dependencies, but the things that we're currently discussing now, like for example, the source code repository, are sort of key components of this, and some of the things that you're talking about, whether it's hey, can these things attest to those things based on identity and whatever else, but those particular components, I feel like if their supply chains have been attacked and they are reporting the wrong information to you, then all of a sudden everything you're doing is also now compromised.
Yeah, I agree that that's a problem that we should solve. We just haven't really addressed it yet, because it's very, I think that it's very easy to say what we want, which is that we want a policy that says that this artifact must meet Salsa level 4, and all of its dependencies must transitively meet Salsa level 4 as well. Now, the problem with that is that graph, that supply chain graph, is enormous and goes back, probably decades. And so the question is how, when can you cut it off, and how can you do it so that you can actually make these decisions within a practical amount of time with the data that you have available?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that for sort of generic sorts of, libraries and sources and those sorts of things. I'm actually thinking more about the system that you're using to actually implement the Salsa stuff, right? So as an example, right, to some extent, I would agree that, with everything you said, and the thing I would say is maybe the first thing that you do look at if you start to look at some of those transitive dependencies is hey, your build system, right? What's the supply chain of that?
Yes, I agree, and I think we had discussed, but maybe not. But I think it's probably not been defined in the requirements table is like a requirement that it's also level 4, that a builder have like that all of the components that the builder uses meet like Salsa level 3, or you know, like you can meet Salsa level 3 for like a month, but then you have to get up to level 4 because a lot of builders build themselves, and so you can't, like, otherwise you could never meet Salsa level 4. There's sort of a bootstrapping issue.
Yeah.
Sorry. But yeah, like I think that would be a very reasonable, like a very reasonable requirement to add, and yeah, it would be pretty valuable.
At one point, we discussed splitting out like source versus builder requirements and having separate tables for those. I don't remember where we landed on that conversation.
Oh, that actually kind of plays into the next item.
Oh, okay, perfect. Let's see where we are. Which one, Matthew? Versioning?
No, the purposes of each level. I can quickly present. It's very short, but basically just conceiving of the levels as sort of bundles of those different requirements. So build, source, and dependencies is another thing. Let me present. And how the latter is meant to sort of gradually work back from work backwards from the sort of artifact back through the build, back through the source, and then finally to dependencies. Yeah, so I mean, this is a somewhat arbitrary 3-stage sort of visual represent, like, you know, schema that I've put here, but sort of going from L1, where you might have build, source, and deps at, you know, just like best effort, sort of confidence, integrity, whatever you want. L2 bumps up build, but still has relatively little to say about source and deps, and not anything really in terms of integrity. Whereas L3 sort of, we have, in many ways, sort of the ideal builder. We don't really have to trust it. It'll just take in and spit out what you give it. And there's some real sort of requirements, you know, assurance we can get from source now that like it's hosting the build definition, stuff like that. Still nothing on depths. And then sort of L4, you've now sort of pushed it back. You have all of the nice two-party review bits of source. You have, you know, the full commit log, stuff like that. And now you start to make statements about dependencies, as Tom was just saying. Yeah, so that, I mean, independent of the way it's phrased in the repo, I think this is a you know, a way that the current ladder ultimately breaks down into those pieces anyway. Yeah.
It's really a tone thing. By the way, I have a request to add access. It's a tone thing more than really an objection overall. But I think of all this stuff in terms of risks. I don't think L1 is better than nothing. I think it's much better than that because you have made things harder than they would have been otherwise. Conversely, at L4, trying to claim that, hey, it's not possible, or you see, you know, something's infeasible. I don't believe you. You know, if you got it, you know, if you're a nation state, maybe it doesn't matter. Okay, I subverted the silicon before it got to you. I subverted all of them. But that doesn't make it very likely, and you certainly have reduced at each of these levels the risks. And so if you characterize this as just, this is an exercise in greatly reducing the risks at each of these levels. I think it's much easier to deal with both the low and the high end. Every level has a value.
Yeah, absolutely.
Without trying to oversell level 4, where, you know,
right. I mean, a lot of the purpose of that write-up is to kind of explain L1, honestly. that like they're clearly like really big dividends it yields. Not, you know, cryptographically verifiable necessarily, but like in terms of scoping and, you know, really getting a handle on the totality of the problem, it's extremely important.
I agree. And I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, David.
As I say, it's just a remarkable number of the problems that have happened out in the real world don't require vast sums to counter. They just require something. So,
yeah, one little thing to
so
go
even
wrong.
L1 has real value. Go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no. Sorry, I just wanted to, I agree. It just requires one little thing to go wrong, not 10 different things at the same time. I agree with you. I agree with your assessment. And I think we shouldn't also think of L4 as this is the ultimate and there's nothing you can do better. I think as long as we agree on that, we're okay.
Thumbs up.
Just a quick thing from an end user perspective, it would also be useful to know, like, you know, hey, those are the goals, but like one of the things I think we would also like to figure out is like, what sorts of attacks could this lower the risks for, right? You know, what sorts of, like, you know, and then maybe what sort of, you know, at what level of sophistication and what areas it's sort of preventing that, because then that helps us sort of figure out, oh, okay, yeah, this doesn't prevent, let's say, an attack against the CI/CD system itself. So we're going to have a mitigating control. We have monitoring or whatever, right? Like things that you would expect that are not in the scope of Salsa itself. Yep. I think that.
Oh no, you're doing good.
Oh no, sorry. I just saw that somebody posted a pull request, which looking at. Let's see, what's this one's add threat and mitigations page. Yeah, I think, yeah, something like this, I think is a good thing, especially for the individual Salsa level. So folks know, like, hey, Salsa 1 doesn't protect against these sorts of attacks, but I have, you know, a solid set of monitoring tools and other scanning tools. Hey, what can I do to help mitigate the stuff that Salsa is currently not helping me today?
Is it feasibly something where a willing test pilot project could be walked through moving from L God knows what to L1 to make this more tangible for people? Because I mean, this is the lower level is basically it's a hygiene play. It's like, here's a basic standard of supply chain hygiene for you to follow, and showing how someone can move from a sort of naive few developers cranking out a project to a more managed, properly hygiene situation could be really useful, and would probably teach the Salsa team a lot too.
Zach, I think that's a great idea, and honestly, from the package deployment side for our company, like, we're kind of trying to see, can we build something like that so that our customers can, then we can use Salsa as that framework, so that if you come on as a customer to deploy your packages, we can help like walk you through that whole process. So this is part of why we're kind of jumping in and kind of having this conversation. There should be a way to do that. It's going to have to be a mix of technical administrative controls. There's going to have to be a way to determine what Salsa level should you be at, and then what can we do to basically help you get check those boxes. Either give you a checklist to do yourself, or give you a way that someone can kind of check those with you to make sure you're doing the best practices.
Right.
Yeah. So a project that I'm in charge of at the CNCF, or co-in charge of at the CNCF, is the supply chain security working group, and we're doing the secure software factory. And one of the goals of the secure software factory is to sort of build a, you know, a flow of a sort of a CI/CD system and whatever additional components that would be able to generate. Right now, you know, we're gearing for something like, hey, if your stuff goes through here, we with the additional extra sort of requirements, we would expect you to be, you know, Salsa 1, like any sort of things that come through there. So that's just sort of stuff like, hey, we're pulling code down from a source thing, we're doing all the right sorts of, you know, we're using in toto, and we're signing the stuff, and we're tracing it through that whole process, and then at the end, hey, you know, this is a Salsa 1 artifact. That's sort of our goal. So we're definitely willing to we don't have a project per se of saying, hey, can we take a project that wouldn't fit in and then sort of say, hey, if you get it to work inside the software factory, I think, we're also looking for that sort of test project as well to walk through that.
Okay.
I think this is a great idea. Like, do people have their own projects that they want to try? Like, it would be nice to have a mix of things, like some stuff from CNCF, some stuff from like other steering committee members, like if they have recommendation from their own company. It would be nice to have a mix of, I would say, 3 to 5 projects that we try against Salsa level 1 and 2.
That's a good idea. I could see where the Datadog, one of our supply chain fits.
Yeah, it would be great if you you wrote down your journey on the way, so we could all use it as a case study too and learn from it.
Should the projects be smaller or bigger? I mean, for example, I reached out to one of the PHP build release managers that I know because large project used by many, but unless things have changed a lot since I last worked on it, a little ad hoc in practices. Like, would a larger project be a good test bed, or is that too big of a place to start?
No, I think it's good to get a mix, especially so like yeah, I just laid out in that doc that like a single developer sort of larger open source project, PHP seems to fit pretty well into that, I'd imagine, and then sort of an enterprise where you have sort of different concerns. Pieces from those buckets would be really useful to test out onboarding.
If I could jump in here, because of course did this with the CI best practices badge stuff. We intentionally went out and worked with projects where we were trying to, in some sense, find the extremes. So we interacted with the Linux kernel, big project, high velocity, widely used. We also talked with curl, single developer, I mean, widely used. And Node and LibreOffice, and there were a couple others. GitHub was an early one too. Not GitHub, GitLab was an early one. But basically, we tried to get several different kinds of projects so that we wouldn't be swayed by, well, we grab projects, but they're all JavaScript projects from company X. Well, they're going to have some things that are going to be the same from everything else. And so, for example, an email-based, development process is going to look totally different than one that uses GitHub or GitLab as their basis.
Yeah, I was just thinking through if there's ways that we can help, some of these projects too, if it's, more engineering resources or sort of understanding the things that they need to try to meet these levels, if it's, infrastructure credits. That's something we're trying to do within the this foundation as well, is just figure out how to best support these critical projects. So the more info we have as folks are trying to harden up their projects, we can feed that back into the technical committee and then the governing board when there is potential funds available for these types of efforts. So that would be good to learn too, as people work on this sort of thing.
Yeah, on the CNCF side, I know we're always looking for more input from folks on the supply chain stuff, and right now we're not in the actual sort of hands-on keyboard, technical implementation, but there are definitely things from just even the reference architecture, especially with this being such an evolving space. There's a lot of different, there's a lot of different tools that help out here, but I don't think, as far as I can tell, outside of like the US federal government, nobody's really implemented an end-to-end sort of solution, or rather I say outside of also internal companies. Nobody in the public space has really implemented an end-to-end solution of like, hey, here's how you do tracing, your supply chain, securing it, yada yada.
I'm hesitant a little bit because it depends on how you interpret those. Certainly, people do worry about this.
Yeah, sorry. What I meant was there is one of the things that's coming up consistently with some of this new stuff, the cloud native and whatever, right? Like some folks are like, hey, if you need to have identity on the individual worker nodes and you need to, be able to sign all the things, there's not really a lot in the space of an end-to-end sort of solution similar to like, hey, I can deploy a Jenkins with some stuff. It's like, oh, here it's like, we would love to be able to say, you deploy, in this case, like we're looking at stuff like Tecton, but you can deploy a Tecton with some of these things and you get that supply chain, some elements of supply chain security.
I'm glad I wore the shirt for the occasion.
I was gonna say that's a really cool logo.
It's the Tecton robot cat. Cool. So we have about 7 minutes left. Can we touch on one of these last topic quick, or maybe punt one of them to the next time? I think these are the two left. Am I right on that? So maybe jump into versioning for the next 5 minutes and then see where we land on that, and then we can move these other topics to issue discussion, email discussion, or pick them up next time. Who added the versioning?
That was me. So at the moment, Salsa is still like in alpha according to the page, and what we've seen with some of the folks that we're talking to is they are trying to plan products and communications and so forth, and they're like, when is it going to come out of alpha to some version that they can point to so that they can plan accordingly. And I think that there are a couple of outstanding issues that are sort of going one way or the other in terms of whether or not source control should be required at L1, whether config as code should be required. But apart from that, I remember that like the C++ standard committee, like they had this big problem with like versioning where like it would take them what it took them years and years to like get a particular version out because they were just trying to get everything into it. And I was wondering if we should plan, if we could schedule version releases so that like releasing a Salsa version by like the end of September might not, like, doesn't mean that if your thing doesn't get in there for the September release, that doesn't mean it's never getting in. That just means that it might not get in until the March release. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts there. And then also like what should we do in order to get to 1.0?
I don't know. One thing would be to require consensus from the steering committee. That would be my guess, and set a deadline on it at least. Versioning is interesting. I'm not sure how we would do this.
And for getting to 1.0, I would imagine that there need to be trial implementations, a certain number, so we could have some sense of how easy this is to do, etc. Because flagging it as 1.0, but having it be really tough for the desired audiences to get their head around would be a bad thing.
Right. Again, I'll pull up the experiences of the CI Best Practices badge, where we had first drafts of requirements, but it was, I think, something like 9 months before we finally said, okay, this is the official 1.0 version. Because we wanted to make sure that in fact multiple organizations could implement them. So I think need trial implementations. I would think that's key. I mean, call it a draft or whatever, but be able to point to specific implementations that you can others can look at. I would say trial public implementations.
Certainly on the public front, absolutely.
Yeah, because if it's, I mean, it's good that a company says, "Hey, we're doing it," but others are going to struggle learning from it. Yeah. But when there's public implementations, then people can learn from them. And it also has a I don't know if other people are doing it's I don't want to say it's lemmings like, but you know, then people can learn from them and are more likely to do them. I mean, just for the simple reason, I think rightly people don't want to be the first ones typically. It's taking a chance. It's a smaller number of people.
So
go ahead.
I guess I was just going to ask, like, what should we do then so that those first movers have something that they can point to that says this is what we did, right? Like if we're changing requirements from one week to the next, then it's hard for anyone to say, oh, this is Salsa 1 or 2. Well, like which version do you mean?
Yeah, agreed. You need a stable point that you can run the trials on, and you need a diversity of project sizes so that when people are looking at these existing implementations for inspiration, they're not all trying to replicate Kubernetes when that's like not tractable for the majority of open source projects.
Will minor version releases make sense? Because then we can create things and maybe have a first version 0.1, like.
Yeah, just do it like software, 0.8, 0.1, 0.2.
Tom, will that address your concern, like minor release or?
Yeah, that that'd be totally fine. Like the folks that I talk to, they would be completely fine. Like as long as they can say we're Salsa this, like this thing is what we did, and not have it be obsoleted because of a change that we're making as like we're developing the standard. So I think then the question is I mean, like it probably is like, well, the steering committee needs to decide like should we resolve these, like this one sort of remaining issue about, or maybe two issues about source control and config as code, so that we can label 0.1 and then move on, or should we leave those things to 0.2?
I think we should try and resolve them. Yeah, I think it's a tricky position to be in, to ask people to start implementing things when we know there's potentially contentious issues going to potentially contentious changes coming in.
Yeah, I gotta run too. Yeah, I think there's an issue around this too, so feel free to chime in there if that's not the link that goes to the motivation. I'm not sure, but thanks everyone for the great discussion, and we'll kick it up next time. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
See you all next time.
Thanks.